All right, today we're going to dig into a really fascinating idea. It's from a sermon, of all places, and it connects two things you'd probably never think go together: the price of apples at your local store and a massive heat wave at the South Pole. The argument is that these aren't just random events, but part of a much bigger, almost prophetic story. So yeah, let's jump right in.
So it all kicks off with a question I'm pretty sure we've all asked recently, probably while staring at a grocery bill. Why are your apples so expensive? The source material we're exploring really hones in on this, using a specific example from Korea where apple prices just skyrocketed. You'd think, okay, simple supply and demand, right? But what if it's not that simple? What if it's a sign of something way, way bigger?
Right? Because at the exact same time farmers were stressing about their crops, something absolutely wild was going on thousands of miles away. I mean, Antarctica, the coldest place on the planet, got hit with a heat wave that just didn't break records, it obliterated them. So how on earth could expensive apples in Asia and melting ice at the South Pole be connected? Well, this is where it gets interesting. The sermon we're looking at says they are connected, and not just that, it says the connection was predicted long ago.
And here it is. This is the central thesis that turns everything on its head. According to this sermon, these aren't just random blips, not weird weather, not a fluke in the market, no. They're seen as a literal sign of the end times. And just like that, we pivot, hard. We're moving from a practical, economic discussion to a deeply spiritual one. This really sets the stage for looking at our world in a completely different light.
Now, to back this up, the sermon doesn't just ask for blind faith. It actually points to some pretty startling data. You look at the two events side by side. First, the apple crisis in Korea. The cause? A sustained temperature jump of 3.3 degrees Celsius over 20 years in the main growing areas. That's what caused the frost, the disease, the bad harvest. Then you've got Antarctica. The temperature there spiked, get this, 38.5 degrees Celsius above the seasonal average. That's just staggering. The whole point here is to say, look, this isn't just a vague feeling. These are real, measurable signs that our world is seriously out of whack.
So this really brings us to the core question the sermon wants us to grapple with. What is the actual connection between a bad apple harvest and melting polar ice? You know, a scientist would probably talk about atmospheric rivers or jet streams, but this sermon, it points us in a totally different direction. It suggests the answer isn't buried in a climate model, but in an ancient spiritual text. And here's the answer it offers up, pulled straight from the Gospel of Luke. This one verse is basically presented as the codebreaker for everything. The verse talks about nations in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. And from this perspective, that's not just some nice old-timey poetry. No, it's seen as a direct prophecy of the climate chaos we're living through right now. You know, the very chaos that's causing all this fear and confusion around the world. Okay, so based on that scripture, the sermon lays out this kind of prophetic timeline. It's a pretty straightforward three-step sequence. Step 1, the signs appear. You get these weird events in nature like the apple crisis or the polar heat wave. Step 2, humanity freaks out. We respond with fear and confusion, just like the text predicted. And all of this, according to this interpretation, is leading up to a third and final step, the arrival of the one the scripture calls the Son of Man.
But hold on, the analysis doesn't just stop there. It actually goes a layer deeper. The sermon starts asking, okay, why? Why are these signs happening right now? And the answer it gives has nothing to do with carbon emissions or government policy. It argues that all this climate stuff, it's just a symptom. The real root cause, the actual disease, is what it calls a crisis of consciousness.
And to build this case about our inner crisis, the sermon does something pretty unexpected. It turns to ancient Greek philosophy. It pulls out that classic line from Socrates, "The unexamined life is not worth living." The whole point being that we as a society have just gotten so busy, so distracted, that we've totally lost the ability to just stop, to think, to actually reflect on our lives and why we do the things we do.
And there's actually a name for this condition, a term the sermon borrows from the philosopher Herbert Marcuse. He called it the one-dimensional man. And what does that mean? Well, it's a person who's so caught up in consumerism, in the daily grind, that they just lose the ability to think critically. They can't even imagine that life could be any other way. It's like their entire existence has been spiritually flattened into just getting and spending.
To really drive this point home,
To make that feeling of being trapped feel real, the sermon uses this incredibly powerful metaphor from literature, Kafka's Metamorphosis. The idea is that we've become like the main character, Gregor Samsa, who famously wakes up one morning transformed into a giant bub. You know, you're still kind of you on the inside, but you're trapped in this monstrous shell, totally cut off, stuck in a pointless routine you can't escape.
And this is where the sermon brilliantly ties that modern philosophical idea right back to its biblical roots. It points to another verse in Luke which basically warns against becoming that exact one-dimensional person. It says to be careful that your hearts aren't weighed down with the anxieties of life. And that's the trap. Our obsession with jobs, money, status, that's what weighs us down and leaves us completely unprepared for what's coming.
Okay, so if that's the problem, what's the solution? Well, the sermon lays out a pretty clear three-step path to what it calls wakefulness. It's simple. Step 1, be aware. Just be aware of the trap of consumerism and daily anxieties. Step 2, be reflective. Actually do that Socratic thing and examine your own life. And step 3, be prayerful. This is presented as the absolute key to staying spiritually awake.
And that third step, prayer, is really framed as the most important one. In this way of thinking, prayer isn't just some empty ritual. It's actually called the shortcut, the fastest, most direct way to get back that ability to self-reflect. The very thing our busy, materialistic world is designed to crush.
So all of this builds to the sermon's big conclusion. What actually happens on that day the scripture keeps talking about? Well, according to this source, it's not some single, one-size-fits-all apocalypse. Instead, what happens to you depends entirely on your inner state. It all comes down to one question. Are you spiritually asleep, or are you awake and watching?
And here's where we see the two completely different futures it lays out. On one hand, you have the spiritually asleep, that one-dimensional person. For them, the end is terrifying. It's judgment. It's watching everything they valued, all the stuff, the status, just crumble. But then, for the watchful, that very same moment is something else entirely. It's not an end, but a beginning. It's redemption. It's a moment of incredible hope and salvation.
And to really hammer home this hopeful message, the sermon brings us back to Luke one last time. It points out that the exact same signs that cause all that anguish and perplexity in most people, well, for the watchful, those signs are a signal to do the complete opposite. The instruction is to lift up your heads. It's an incredible flip of the script, right? It turns a story of global terror into one of personal, joyful expectation.
So when you put it all together, what we've really looked at here is a complete reframing of the climate crisis. In this view, melting glaciers, crazy weather, economic panic, those aren't the real problems. They're just the outward symptoms of a much deeper spiritual crisis. And maybe, just maybe, they're meant to be a final, desperate wake-up call.
And that leaves us with the really challenging question this sermon wants you to ask yourself. When you look at the headlines, when you see what's happening in the world, are you seeing signs of a terrifying end, or are you seeing the birth pains of a hopeful new beginning? According to this perspective, the answer isn't out there in the world. It's in here, in the state of your own heart.